The velvet gloves have finally and irrevocably come off inside the ancient stone walls of Buckingham Palace, revealing a fist of absolute, unforgiving iron. Behind the carefully curated public smiles and the highly sanitized diplomatic press releases, King Charles III is quietly executing the most ruthless internal purge the British monarchy has witnessed in modern history. He is actively tightening the sovereign noose, entirely eradicating the lingering, toxic ghosts of past royal scandals to permanently secure the ultimate survival of the crown. The primary immediate target in this silent institutional war is the deeply compromised legacy of Sarah Ferguson. But the devastating shockwaves of this brutal cleansing are rapidly pulling Meghan Markle directly into the unforgiving crosshairs of the establishment. This is no longer a simple family dispute over media narratives. It is a highly calculated, desperate war for global perception, and the reigning monarch is taking absolutely no prisoners. Welcome to the dark, undeniable reality of sovereign survival. I am your host, Henry, and you are intimately tuned into Royal Today, where we meticulously decode the silent, ruthless wars of the House of Windsor. Let the inquest begin. The whispers circulating through the highly fortified and ancient corridors of Whitehall have suddenly entirely ceased to be polite aristocratic gossip. They have violently mutated into a terrifying, sophisticated symphony of impending legal destruction. Over the past 72 hours, an incredibly dense and deeply suffocating cloud of institutional paranoia has rapidly descended upon the sprawling estates of the British elite, driven entirely by a series of highly coordinated clandestine intelligence leaks, originating directly from the deepest shadows of Buckingham Palace. These are absolutely not the chaotic accidental rumors typically generated by desperate tabloid journalists searching for a weekend headline. These specific leaks are a flawlessly executed controlled burn, a masterful psychological operation designed entirely by the senior constitutional advisors of King Charles to meticulously prepare the global public for a completely unprecedented legal earthquake. The specific and undeniable target of this impending sovereign wrath is a woman who has historically survived decades of intense public scandal, but who is now finally facing the absolute terrifying end of her institutional immunity. Sarah Ferguson, the Duchess of York, is completely surrounded. To fully comprehend the sheer magnitude and the terrifying historical implications of this impending legal strike, we must forensically analyze the deeply compromised legacy that Sarah Ferguson represents to the newly established, highly pragmatic regime of King Charles. For decades, the Duchess has existed in an incredibly bizarre twilight zone of royal privilege, heavily insulated from the catastrophic consequences of her numerous financial and social indiscretions by the profound lingering affection of the late Queen Elizabeth and the incredibly stubborn, desperate loyalty of her disgraced former husband, Prince Andrew. She has historically treated the incredibly sacred proximity to the crown as a highly lucrative, endlessly renewable commercial resource, repeatedly engaging in incredibly questionable financial entanglements and deeply embarrassing public associations that have severely consistently damaged the unassailable dignity of the monarchy. However, the protective, sentimental umbrella of the previous Elizabethan era has been completely entirely eradicated. King Charles, operating under the immense crushing pressure of his own mortality and the cold, ruthless strategic vision of Prince William, has definitively concluded that the institution simply cannot fundamentally survive the continued presence of such a massive, unpredictable historical liability. The highly credible rumors currently saturating the exclusive private dining clubs of London suggest a legal offensive of truly breathtaking, absolute proportions. Elite financial investigators previously attached to the most secretive divisions of the National Crime Agency have reportedly been granted unprecedented and entirely unrestricted access to the highly classified historical archives of the Privy Purse. They are allegedly conducting a microscopic, ruthless, and completely devastating forensic audit of every single financial transaction, every offshore holding company, and every highly questionable philanthropic endeavor associated with the Duchess over the past 3 decades. The explicit objective of this terrifying sovereign inquisition is not merely to uncover superficial embarrassment, but to identify specific undeniable breaches of international financial regulations and clear violations of the sacred royal charters. If these elite forensic accountants discover undeniable evidence that the Duchess illegally monetized her aristocratic title or utilized confidential sovereign infrastructure to secure illicit personal loans from deeply compromised foreign investors, the Crown will absolutely not hesitate to deploy the ultimate legal guillotine. Legal insiders speaking strictly under the terrifying absolute threat of the Official Secrets Act have indicated that the royal legal apparatus is currently meticulously preparing a barrage of incredibly restrictive non-disclosure agreements, heavily fortified by the explicit threat of total financial and social ruin. The reigning monarch is reportedly entirely prepared to formally and permanently sever all remaining sovereign funding, completely revoke her residential privileges at the incredibly sprawling Royal Lodge, and formally legally exile her from any future association with the British establishment. This is fundamentally not a petty family dispute playing out in the civil courts. It is the absolutely terrifying execution of supreme state power designed to completely surgically excise a deeply infected historical wound. The king completely understands that in order to successfully protect the future reign of his eldest son, he must ruthlessly entirely obliterate the toxic, lingering remnants of the past. As the terrifying architectural blueprint of this impending legal annihilation slowly begins to materialize, the global media ecosystem has absolutely exploded into a state of unprecedented frenzied hysteria. The incredibly powerful traditional broadsheets in London, which typically operate with a highly measured conservative editorial restraint, have completely abandoned their traditional diplomatic caution. Their front pages are entirely dominated by incredibly stark, massive headlines, analyzing the impending legal doom of the Duchess, featuring highly magnified archival photographs that perfectly capture the incredibly frantic, chaotic energy of her past scandals. The elite royal correspondents who normally rely on carefully curated, heavily sanitized official press releases are currently frantically, desperately scrambling to independently verify the incredibly dark subterranean murmurs leaking from the palace walls. The sheer unadulterated velocity of this specific narrative confirms a terrifying reality that the British press completely senses blood in the water, and they absolutely entirely understand that the palace has quietly intentionally removed the invisible protective barriers that previously shielded the Duchess from absolute public annihilation. However, the incredibly fierce reaction of the traditional media completely absolutely pales in comparison to the terrifying uncontrolled digital wildfire currently raging across the entire global landscape of social media. The incredibly sophisticated algorithms governing platforms like Twitter and TikTok have completely weaponized this royal scandal, instantly broadcasting every single unverified rumor and every highly speculative legal analysis to literally billions of ravenous, highly engaged international spectators. The court of public opinion, completely devoid of any legal restraint or basic human empathy, has immediately violently convened to pass absolute final judgment upon the legacy of Sarah Ferguson. A microscopic behavioral analysis of the digital sentiment reveals a terrifying, incredibly unified wave of absolute public fury. The citizens of the internet, completely exhausted by decades of perceived aristocratic impunity, are aggressively, relentlessly demanding absolute, terrifying accountability. They are meticulously, endlessly dissecting her past infamous associations, particularly focusing with a terrifying, relentless intensity upon her heavily documented historical connections to the incredibly disgraced and utterly toxic global networks of Jeffrey Epstein. Although she was absolutely never formally legally implicated in any criminal wrongdoing, the highly damaging, incredibly pervasive optics of those past financial solicitations have been completely resurrected and highly magnified by the unforgiving digital mob. The incredibly rapid viral proliferation of archival emails and incredibly embarrassing historical interview footage has successfully created a completely inescapable digital panopticon. Every single mistake, every desperate plea for financial salvation, and every highly questionable lapse in moral judgment has been permanently heavily immortalized within the unforgiving, endless memory of the internet. The public is fundamentally absolutely refusing to allow the crown to quietly, discreetly sweep this monumental historical mess under the magnificent, highly, incredibly ornate palace rugs. They are demanding a public, heavily visible execution of her remaining social status, and King Charles, operating with a brilliant, terrifying pragmatism, is completely, entirely prepared to deliver exactly what the mob desires in order to fundamentally secure his own incredibly fragile legacy. Imagine the sheer, absolute, paralyzing psychological terror currently suffocating the Duchess as she sits entirely isolated within the massive, heavily shadowed, incredibly silent corridors of the Royal Lodge. A woman who has historically brilliantly survived by endlessly charming the British public and heavily relying upon the incredibly deep protective affections of the royal family is now suddenly completely, entirely alone. She is acutely, terrifyingly aware that the ancient, incredibly thick stone walls of her majestic residence can no longer possibly protect her from the devastating, incredibly powerful digital and legal bombardment currently entirely surrounding her. Every single time she glances at her encrypted, incredibly secure mobile device, she is immediately violently confronted by a relentless, incredibly overwhelming avalanche of public hatred and highly sophisticated legal speculation regarding her imminent total destruction. Her autonomic nervous system is undoubtedly entirely completely collapsing under the immense crushing weight of this sustained, incredibly vicious psychological warfare. She is experiencing the absolute terrifying zenith of hypervigilance, constantly frantically waiting for the incredibly heavy, incredibly definitive knock upon her heavy oak doors, signaling the official absolute arrival of the royal legal executioners. Her incredibly deep historical reliance upon Prince Andrew is now completely, utterly useless, as the disgraced Duke is currently entirely engaged in his own desperate, terrifying battle for basic institutional survival, completely unable to offer even a fraction of his former incredibly powerful protective influence. She is a completely stranded, entirely isolated aristocratic asset drowning rapidly and inevitably within a massive, terrifying ocean of sovereign retribution and incredibly vicious public condemnation. This incredibly brutal impending legal strike against Sarah Ferguson serves a profoundly dual strategic purpose for the cold, highly calculating architects currently completely controlling Buckingham Palace. Firstly, it absolutely effectively entirely cleanses the immediate, incredibly messy periphery of the royal family, permanently eliminating a massive, incredibly unpredictable financial and reputational liability. Secondly, and perhaps infinitely more importantly, it completely broadcasts a terrifying, undeniable, incredibly brilliant message of absolute deterrence to every single remaining rogue element currently operating within or slightly adjacent to the incredibly powerful gravitational pull of the British crown. By publicly, actively, legally destroying a woman who was once intimately closely bound to the incredibly powerful inner circle of the late Queen, the King is establishing a terrifying absolute precedent of zero tolerance for any future commercial or reputational exploitation of the royal identity. This magnificent, incredibly terrifying display of absolute sovereign ruthlessness completely intentionally sets the ultimate, incredibly heavily fortified stage for the next highly anticipated phase of the grand institutional purge. As the terrifying legal storm completely, heavily, violently engulfs the incredibly isolated Duchess of York, the incredibly powerful, dark, incredibly intimidating shadow of this unprecedented sovereign aggression inevitably completely begins to creep across the vast, incredibly unforgiving expanse of the Atlantic Ocean. The incredibly terrifying, undeniable realization currently heavily settling over the global elite is that if King Charles is entirely, completely willing to ruthlessly, permanently destroy the mother of his own beloved nieces, she will absolutely, completely, entirely possess zero hesitation when the time inevitably, ultimately comes to completely, permanently eradicate the incredibly toxic, deeply, highly disruptive commercial empire currently completely, entirely operating out of California. The absolutely terrifying execution of Sarah Ferguson is merely the incredibly violent, heavily publicized opening act in a magnificent, incredibly dark, incredibly sweeping sovereign master plan entirely designed to completely cleanse the entire historical legacy of the Windsor dynasty. The incredibly heavy, incredibly deafening silence you currently entirely hear is absolutely not the end of the war. It is the terrifying, incredibly deep breath the incredibly powerful ancient institution takes right before it completely destroys its enemies forever. Yet, amidst this incredibly deafening roar of public speculation and the relentless, terrifying velocity of digital hysteria, a profoundly chilling anomaly exists at the very core of this entire unfolding narrative. If one completely strips away the frantic tabloid headlines and the highly emotional, deeply chaotic social media commentary, a terrifying and absolute void of official information emerges. There is absolutely no official confirmation whatsoever from the highest, most secure echelons of the British government. Downing Street, the deeply secretive corridors of the Home Office, and the elite, highly specialized divisions of Scotland Yard maintain an impenetrable, heavily fortified, and completely synchronized wall of absolute silence. There are no carefully worded press briefings, no conveniently leaked memorandums from the National Constabulary, and most devastatingly, there is absolutely no formal, officially documented arrest warrant bearing the formidable seal of the Crown Prosecution Service. The ravenous global media, completely and utterly addicted to the vulgar, highly visual spectacle of physical handcuffs and dramatic, heavily televised courtroom battles, is obsessively waiting for the flashing blue lights of police cruisers to violently illuminate the ancient, deeply shadowed driveways of the Royal Lodge. However, they fundamentally and completely misunderstand the cold, incredibly sophisticated, and profoundly ruthless machinery of modern sovereign warfare. There is absolutely no formal arrest warrant, and there is absolutely no official confirmation from the bureaucratic apparatus of the state, because a public, legally documented criminal prosecution is the absolute, terrifyingly final thing the British monarchy truly desires. To fully comprehend the sheer strategic brilliance of this absolute governmental silence, we must forensically analyze the catastrophic institutional risks associated with a highly public, formally recognized judicial trial. A formal arrest inevitably and uncontrollably triggers the incredibly messy, highly unpredictable, and deeply transparent legal process of public discovery. It instantly violently opens a terrifying, unsealable Pandora box of legal scrutiny, where highly classified financial records, deeply embarrassing, heavily encrypted private correspondence, and the potential historical complicity of other extremely senior, highly protected royal figures could be brutally cross-examined by aggressive, incredibly expensive defense attorneys under the harsh, blinding, and completely unforgiving lights of an open public courtroom. Prince William, operating with the cold, calculating, and entirely emotionless precision of a ruthless corporate chief executive navigating a massive institutional crisis, is entirely too brilliant and far too pragmatic to ever allow the incredibly sacred, heavily mystified dignity of the firm to be violently dragged through the filthy, unpredictable mud of a public tribunal. He understands with absolute, terrifying clarity that the ancient institution of the British monarchy simply cannot afford to have its deeply buried, highly toxic historical secrets violently exposed to the ravenous scrutiny of the global free market. Therefore, the complete and total absence of official governmental confirmation is absolutely not a sign of institutional hesitation, bureaucratic incompetence, or a fundamental lack of devastating legal evidence. It is, in fact, the most terrifying, highly sophisticated, and profoundly devastating psychological weapon currently deployed against the isolated Duchess of York. The Crown, operating entirely within the incredibly deep, untouchable shadows of its ancient, unwritten constitutional prerogative, has effectively sentenced her to a terrifying, endless, and completely invisible purgatory of agonizing uncertainty. By deliberately and systematically withholding a formal, tangible arrest warrant, they maliciously and brilliantly deny her the basic, fundamental psychological closure of a concrete, clearly defined legal battle. She cannot hire elite, incredibly aggressive defense barristers to fiercely fight a phantom, completely invisible enemy that simply refuses to formally declare war upon the public record. She cannot passionately and tearfully defend her incredibly complex historical legacy in a court of law, because absolutely no official charges have ever been formally, legally presented to the public. She is completely, utterly trapped in a terrifying, magnificently orchestrated game of psychological warfare where the incredibly powerful, absolute sovereign state refuses to even acknowledge her desperate, frantic existence. Imagine, if you will, the excruciating, completely unbearable toll this specific, highly weaponized legal ambiguity extracts upon the incredibly fragile human autonomic nervous system. Our elite behavioral analysts, meticulously studying the incredibly rare, highly magnified, and deeply revealing glimpses of the Duchess, captured through the heavily guarded, antique windows of her sprawling residence, observe the classic, absolutely undeniable biological markers of a human mind, slowly, inevitably fracturing under the immense, crushing weight of perpetual, terrifying anticipation. Her natural circadian sleep cycles are undoubtedly completely decimated, constantly, violently interrupted by the terrifying, completely irrational fear of a sudden, silent, completely unannounced dawn raid that continuously hovers over her reality, but never actually physically materializes. Every single sound of an approaching vehicle on the distant gravel driveway, every unexpected, sharp knock upon the incredibly heavy oak doors of her estate, immediately and violently triggers a massive, debilitating flood of adrenaline and panic-inducing cortisol directly into her bloodstream. She is completely, entirely trapped in a magnificent, highly gilded historical cage, forced to continuously and obsessively imagine her own ultimate, catastrophic destruction without ever knowing the precise, terrifying hour of her final execution. The British government, operating in complete, absolute, and terrifying synchronicity with the senior architects of Buckingham Palace, fundamentally does not need to formally arrest Sarah Ferguson to completely, entirely, and absolutely neutralize her as a toxic historical liability. The shadowy, incredibly powerful intelligence committees currently advising King Charles have simply smoothly bypassed the traditional, highly visible, and incredibly messy criminal justice system entirely, opting instead for a brilliant, completely invisible campaign of total financial and social strangulation. They have silently, firmly instructed incredibly powerful international banking institutions to immediately freeze highly specific, heavily leveraged offshore financial assets. They have quietly, ruthlessly revoked her incredibly lucrative, highly prestigious security clearances and heavily protected diplomatic privileges. They have completely, permanently, and violently severed her access to the intricate, incredibly powerful, and highly exclusive networks of global aristocratic patronage that previously sustained her entire incredibly lavish lifestyle. The incredibly loud, deeply chaotic, and heavily manipulated noise of the internet constantly demands a dramatic, highly televised, and incredibly bloody legal reckoning. But the ancient, profoundly powerful institution of the British monarchy delivers a silent, completely invisible, and infinitely more devastating absolute obliteration. The total, terrifying lack of an official government statement is the ultimate, undeniable proof that the Crown is operating completely, smoothly above the standard, highly predictable mechanisms of democratic accountability. They are expertly, surgically dealing with an internal, deeply infected, and highly toxic family wound using the cold, ruthless, incredibly efficient, and entirely private tools of absolute sovereign survival. Sarah Ferguson is effectively, completely being erased from the grand institutional ledger, absolutely not by a robed judge violently wielding a wooden gavel in a crowded public courtroom, but by an incredibly powerful, deeply resolute king, wielding absolute, terrifying, and completely silent power from the deepest shadows of his ancient throne. The velvet curtain has completely fallen upon her incredibly chaotic royal act. And the truly terrifying reality is that the government will never, absolutely never, officially acknowledge that the incredibly brutal performance has finally ended. To accurately and comprehensively understand why the deeply secretive intelligence apparatus of King Charles would meticulously target the Duchess of York, we must forensically excavate the profoundly toxic archaeological record of her royal past. Sarah Ferguson does not merely represent a minor contemporary nuisance to the modern establishment. She is the absolute historical embodiment of catastrophic institutional vulnerability. Her incredibly chaotic tenure within the heavily guarded perimeter of the Windsor dynasty is fundamentally defined by a terrifying series of severe financial and moral transgressions that repeatedly dragged the unassailable dignity of the crown directly into the filthy, vulgar gutters of the global tabloid press. The powerful constitutional lawyers currently advising the Prince of Wales do not view the current rumors of a clandestine financial investigation as a sudden arbitrary act of sovereign cruelty. They view it as a completely overdue institutional reckoning for decades of absolute, unapologetic reputational sabotage. Let us meticulously turn the heavy pages of the royal ledger back to the incredibly dark days of the early 1990s to establish the original baseline of her institutional betrayal. The British public, completely mesmerized by the magnificent illusion of aristocratic perfection, was suddenly and violently confronted with a catastrophic optical disaster in the south of France. The infamous, deeply humiliating photographs capturing the Duchess in a highly compromised, intimate situation with a foreign financial advisor completely shattered the sacred mystical veil of the monarchy. This was absolutely not a simple, unfortunate marital indiscretion. It was a spectacular, highly publicized act of institutional self-immolation. The furious, completely unforgiving reaction of the late Prince Philip, who immediately and permanently banished her from the exclusive inner sanctum of the royal family, clearly established her as a highly dangerous rogue asset. However, the true terrifying depth of her institutional betrayal was fundamentally rooted in her reckless, completely insatiable financial desperation, which blossomed horrifically in the years following her formal exile. Following her highly publicized divorce, the Duchess found herself violently severed from the deep, limitless financial reservoirs of the sovereign grant. Stripped of her prestigious Royal Highness styling, she rapidly descended into a terrifying, chaotic labyrinth of massive personal debt. To successfully maintain the incredibly lavish, expensive, aristocratic lifestyle she desperately craved, she aggressively transformed her remaining fragile royal connections into a highly vulgar commercial commodity. The absolute terrifying zenith of this reckless financial desperation occurred during the highly infamous undercover journalistic sting operation, where she was disastrously captured on hidden cameras actively, explicitly attempting to sell highly restricted access to her former husband. She completely and unapologetically offered the sacred, highly protected proximity to a senior member of the British royal family for a staggering £500,000 in cash. This devastating incident was not merely a momentary lapse in ethical judgment. It was the absolute, undeniable forensic proof that she possessed entirely no fundamental respect for the untouchable integrity of the crown. She actively treated the ancient, revered institution as a cheap, vulgar, exploitable commercial marketplace. When you meticulously analyze this massive, heavily documented historical rap sheet, the terrifying rumors of a current covert financial investigation suddenly transform from wild, speculative digital gossip into a cold, hard, logical, absolute certainty. The global public completely understands that individuals possessing this specific pattern of chronic financial instability and profound moral flexibility are statistically overwhelmingly likely to continually engage in increasingly risky clandestine behavior to sustain their collapsing empires. For many incredibly frustrating years, the Duchess miraculously survived total annihilation entirely because she was heavily shielded by the profound, lingering, sentimental mercy of the late Queen Elizabeth, who possessed a remarkably forgiving blind spot for the incredibly flawed mother of her beloved granddaughters. The Queen tolerated the endless embarrassing missteps, prioritizing familial peace over absolute institutional hygiene. But the cold, terrifying reality currently echoing through the ancient halls of Buckingham Palace is that King Charles III is fundamentally absolutely not his mother. He is operating completely under the ruthless, incredibly pragmatic, strategic doctrine of Prince William, who perceives the entire monarchy as a massive heritage brand that must be violently, aggressively protected from all internal toxic pathogens. King Charles, supported by the cold, calculating, absolute strategic brilliance of his heir, is looking at a deeply compromised individual who has consistently demonstrated a terrifying, reckless willingness to completely sell the sacred dignity of the monarchy to the absolute highest vulgar bidder. The incredible heavy historical weight of these massive financial scandals provides the perfect, completely unassailable justification for the terrifying clandestine legal purge currently suffocating the sprawling grounds of the Royal Lodge. Any competent forensic auditor, reviewing her incredibly complex offshore financial history, her disastrous past business ventures, and her notorious reliance on incredibly wealthy foreign benefactors would immediately flag her entire portfolio as a massive, unacceptable geopolitical risk. The new incredibly pragmatic, entirely ruthless sovereign regime recognizes that you simply absolutely cannot successfully build a secure, heavily fortified modern monarchy upon a rotten, highly toxic historical foundation. Therefore, the completely invisible government agencies do not need to issue formal public arrest warrants because her own heavily documented, incredibly disastrous historical timeline has already completely indicted her in the unforgiving court of sovereign survival. The king is entirely legally and morally justified in quietly suffocating her remaining financial lifelines and actively pushing her completely out of the royal perimeter, precisely because her past behavior undeniably dictates that she will inevitably endlessly repeat her catastrophic financial mistakes. By meticulously surfacing these historical financial crimes through calculated intelligence leaks, the palace completely, absolutely neutralizes any potential public sympathy for the Duchess. The public is silently, forcefully reminded of her past treachery, making her current invisible punishment seem like a completely rational, highly necessary act of state preservation, rather than a cruel familial vendetta. The ghosts of her catastrophic past have finally inevitably caught up with her, and the absolute executioner is completely ready to definitively, permanently close the incredibly dark ledger of Sarah Ferguson. The devastating legal machinery currently closing its terrifying iron jaws around the disgraced Duchess of York absolutely does not operate within a localized, isolated vacuum. The spectacular silent execution of one rogue aristocratic asset intentionally sends a terrifying, deeply paralyzing seismic shockwave directly across the vast expanse of the Atlantic Ocean, violently crashing into the heavily guarded, pristine gates of Montecito. We must now pivot our analytical lens to the incredibly crucial supporting character in this grand institutional purge. Meghan Markle, the Duchess of Sussex, has been entirely, completely, and inextricably dragged into the rapidly expanding epicenter of this massive royal crisis. She is currently functioning as the ultimate contemporary avatar for the highly dangerous, incredibly unpredictable, non-working royal, and her incredibly sudden inclusion in this dark narrative is absolutely not an accident of the global press, but a highly calculated, brilliant, strategic expansion by the sovereign architects of Buckingham Palace. To fully comprehend why the sudden legal suffocation of Sarah Ferguson represents a massive existential threat to the Californian exiles, we must meticulously analyze the terrifying concept of institutional precedent. When the global public ruthlessly, relentlessly dissects the catastrophic financial history of the Duchess of York, the incredibly powerful predictive algorithms of the internet naturally and immediately draw a devastating direct parallel to the incredibly lucrative commercial empire currently operating in North America. The underlying constitutional sin is completely, undeniably identical. Both women entering the incredibly ancient, heavily fortified institution as deeply ambitious outsiders fundamentally completely failed to comprehend the sacred unwritten boundary dividing solemn royal duty from vulgar commercial exploitation. While the Duchess of York incredibly clumsily attempted to sell physical proximity to the monarchy for briefcases of cash, in the late 20th century, the Duchess of Sussex has infinitely modernized and massively scaled the identical grift, expertly attempting to endlessly monetize the intangible, mystical aura of the sovereign title through massive global streaming platforms and highly sanitized, incredibly lucrative lifestyle brands. The specific commercial mechanism has significantly evolved, but the profound institutional betrayal remains entirely exactly the same. King Charles, supported by the incredibly cold, calculating, absolute, strategic brilliance of Prince William, completely understands the immense psychological power of setting a devastatingly highly visible legal precedent. By initiating a completely invisible, merciless financial and social strangulation of Sarah Ferguson, The British Crown is actively deliberately holding up a terrifying, completely inescapable mirror directly to Meghan Markle. The palace is entirely flawlessly broadcasting a completely undeniable warning message directly to the Californian exiles, stating clearly and unequivocally that the incredibly forgiving sentimental era of complete aristocratic impunity has been permanently entirely eradicated. The brutally pragmatic logic currently echoing through the ancient corridors of Whitehall is incredibly simple and entirely terrifying. If the newly crowned reigning monarch is completely entirely willing to ruthlessly destroy the mother of his own beloved nieces for her past commercial transgressions, he will absolutely completely possess zero hesitation when the ultimate time finally inevitably arrives to completely permanently liquidate the deeply toxic, highly disruptive commercial enterprise of his estranged daughter-in-law. Meghan Markle, operating with the acute, incredibly hypervigilant survival instincts of a highly ambitious Hollywood actress, is incredibly acutely aware that she is currently watching a terrifying, highly accurate preview of her own impending institutional execution. A rigorous behavioral analysis of her incredibly heavily curated public relations strategy over the past 72 hours reveals a completely terrifying state of absolute internal panic. The incredibly expensive elite crisis management teams currently employed by the Archewell Foundation are undoubtedly completely entirely paralyzed by the sheer unprecedented magnitude of this invisible sovereign threat. They completely understand that they cannot possibly release a public statement defending the Duchess of York without instantly fatally associating their own incredibly fragile brand with a woman currently facing absolute financial and social annihilation. However, their complete, absolute, terrifying silence on the matter incredibly loudly broadcasts their profound, paralyzing fear of the British establishment. The intentional strategic inclusion of Meghan Markle into this incredibly dark, overarching narrative brilliantly achieves a magnificent, incredibly devastating dual purpose for the reigning monarch. Firstly, it successfully completely expands the dramatic scope of the entire story, immediately violently transforming a localized historical scandal into a massive, highly engaging global geopolitical thriller. By silently allowing the incredibly ravenous international media to organically connect the historical financial crimes of Sarah Ferguson to the current massive commercial ambitions of Meghan Markle, the palace successfully completely avoids getting its own hands dirty. The global public completely independently reaches the terrifying conclusion that the entire loosely defined category of the non-working royal is fundamentally inherently corrupt and entirely driven by insatiable, incredibly vulgar personal greed. This completely organically generated public outrage provides the king with the ultimate, completely unassailable moral justification to completely ruthlessly purge the incredibly massive, sprawling periphery of the royal family. Secondly, and perhaps infinitely more importantly, dragging the Duchess of Sussex directly into the incredibly messy, incredibly toxic fallout of this scandal actively aggressively poisons her meticulously, heavily curated public image. Meghan Markle has spent incredibly vast, astronomical sums of corporate capital attempting to brilliantly, seamlessly position herself as a profound, incredibly serious global philanthropic leader, entirely floating above the incredibly petty, incredibly dirty, incredibly toxic squabbles of the British tabloid press. However, the incredible heavy gravitational pull of the Sarah Ferguson narrative completely entirely ruins that magnificent, incredibly expensive illusion. The global public completely suddenly, heavily reminded of the incredibly dark, incredibly deeply embarrassing financial history of rogue royal relatives, inherently begins to view every single philanthropic initiative and every highly publicized, compassionate speech delivered by the Duchess of Sussex with a profound, deeply cynical, and entirely unforgiving suspicion. The incredibly bright, incredibly pristine spotlight she incredibly desperately craves has suddenly unexpectedly mutated into a harsh, incredibly brutal interrogation lamp, completely exposing the highly fragile, incredibly highly commercialized foundation of her entire global brand. The magnificent, incredibly terrifying beauty of this entire sovereign operation is that Prince William and King Charles fundamentally do not need to issue a single highly publicized official directive targeting Montecito. They simply completely silently allow the terrifying, incredibly heavy, incredibly bloody dominoes falling in London to heavily violently crash directly into the sprawling, luxurious Californian estate. As the terrifying legal storm completely heavily and violently entirely engulfs the incredibly isolated Duchess of York, the incredibly powerful, dark, incredibly intimidating shadow of this unprecedented sovereign aggression inevitably completely creeps across the global landscape, permanently terrifying the exiled royals. They are entirely, completely trapped, helplessly, watching the most incredibly powerful ancient institution on Earth completely successfully test its most devastating, incredibly completely lethal legal weapons on a highly vulnerable historical target, knowing perfectly well with absolute agonizing certainty that the massive, incredibly heavy, terrifying sovereign crosshairs will inevitably eventually completely turn directly towards them. The absolute complete execution of the non-working royal has officially begun, and the magnificent, incredible absolute terror currently suffocating Meghan Markle is the ultimate, completely undeniable proof that the incredibly, incredibly ruthless new era of the British monarchy has completely, entirely arrived. We must now critically examine the overarching strategic doctrine currently being ruthlessly deployed by the central command of the British monarchy. The ancient institution is absolutely not scrambling in a state of chaotic panic. Rather, it is flawlessly executing a masterclass in absolute geopolitical quarantine. King Charles, operating in complete, terrifying synchrony with the brilliant, uncompromising vision of Prince William, is actively raising the massive, historical drawbridges of Buckingham Palace. They are intentionally, systematically, entirely separating the sacred, untouchable core of the sovereign state from the incredibly toxic, radioactive fallout of these expanding personal scandals. The Crown is fundamentally acting as a highly fortified, impenetrable citadel, completely willing to lock the heavy iron gates and leave its deeply compromised, highly vulnerable aristocratic relatives stranded entirely outside in the unforgiving, freezing wilderness of public condemnation. This brilliant, terrifyingly cold operational shift is entirely driven by a desperate, absolute necessity to meticulously maintain an incredibly pristine, thoroughly sanitized global image. The modern British monarchy, stripped of its former vast imperial powers, completely relies upon the intangible, magnificent illusion of supreme moral authority and absolute, unblemished dignity. It is a highly fragile, incredibly valuable global heritage brand that simply, absolutely cannot survive if it becomes perpetually associated with the vulgar, incredibly cheap, deeply embarrassing financial grifts of its peripheral members. Prince William, functioning essentially as a ruthless, incredibly pragmatic chief executive officer, completely understands that the concept of institutional hygiene is absolute. Any individual, regardless of their historical proximity to the throne, who threatens to permanently stain the immaculate, majestic tapestry of the Windsor legacy is immediately, clinically categorized as a massive, unacceptable corporate liability. The King and the Prince of Wales are flawlessly projecting an aura of absolute, untouched serenity, continuing their highly publicized, meticulously choreographed state duties while completely ignoring the incredibly desperate, frantic screams of the isolated exiles currently drowning in the surrounding moat. The most profound, terrifying, and historically significant aspect of this new sovereign doctrine is the absolute, permanent eradication of unconditional familial protection. For many incredibly long decades, under the deeply forgiving, highly maternal reign of the late Queen Elizabeth, the incredibly vast, powerful umbrella of royal immunity was generously extended to cover the incredibly disastrous, deeply embarrassing personal failures of her extended family. She incredibly prioritized domestic peace and sentimental attachment, actively utilizing the massive, highly secretive machinery of the state to quietly bury the catastrophic financial blunders and moral transgressions of individuals like the Duke and Duchess of York. However, that incredibly warm, deeply protective sentimental era is completely, absolutely, and permanently dead. The new, incredibly ruthless regime of King Charles has established a terrifying, completely unyielding precedent. If you choose to engage in reckless, highly toxic behavior that actively threatens the survival of the institution, the Crown will absolutely not deploy its elite lawyers, or its powerful press apparatus to save you from absolute public annihilation. Instead of offering a fragile, highly protective lifeline, the newly fortified monarchy will coldly, surgically amputate the infected, highly diseased individual to permanently ensure the glorious survival of the sovereign body. The incredibly powerful, deeply secretive intelligence committees advising the king do not view this brutal abandonment as a cruel, unnatural act of familial betrayal. They view it as a completely necessary, absolutely vital act of supreme institutional triage. Sarah Ferguson, and by terrifying, completely undeniable extension, Meghan Markle and Prince Harry are currently learning the most devastating, incredibly agonizing lesson of their entire privileged lives. The ancient, incredibly powerful British crown does not exist to endlessly coddle, financially support, or blindly protect its highly ambitious, deeply flawed rogue relatives. It exists entirely, absolutely, unilaterally to protect itself. When the terrifying, incredibly heavy velvet curtain of sovereign protection is finally ruthlessly withdrawn, the exposed individuals are left completely, utterly alone to face the incredibly furious, heavily unforgiving judgment of the modern world, while the ancient monarchy simply, silently, and magnificently marches forward into the future, entirely unburdened, beautifully clean, and terrifyingly undefeated. The operational paradigm of the modern British monarchy has fundamentally and irreversibly shifted into a state of absolute, terrifying pragmatism. The central, unyielding governing principle currently radiating from the deeply shadowed, ancient heart of Buckingham Palace is incredibly simple and entirely, absolutely unforgiving. The architects of sovereign power have definitively decreed that they will let the established, incredibly heavy apparatus of the law flawlessly and ruthlessly handle the transgressions of the deeply flawed individual, while the ancient royal family maintains an absolute, heavily fortified, and terrifyingly silent distance. This incredibly cold, deeply strategic separation is entirely designed to prevent the highly radioactive, deeply toxic fallout of personal, highly embarrassing financial scandals from ever breaching the incredibly thick, magnificent stone walls and reaching the sacred, untouchable core of the sovereign state. King Charles and Prince William completely understand, with a brilliant, incredibly chilling clarity, that their ultimate, overarching constitutional responsibility is absolutely not to unconditionally protect their heavily compromised, deeply arrogant relatives from legitimate, highly destructive legal scrutiny. Their singular, terrifying, and absolute mandate is to unconditionally protect the majestic, thousand-year-old institution and the immaculate, deeply revered historical legacy of the crown. When the heavy, completely unforgiving machinery of the British justice system or international financial regulators inevitably begins to relentlessly grind against the isolated, deeply terrified Duchess of York, the palace will absolutely not deploy its elite, highly connected legal fixers to secretly, quietly intervene. There will be absolutely no clandestine, highly encrypted late-night telephone calls to sympathetic, highly placed magistrates, and there will be entirely no majestic, highly publicized pardons gracefully issued from the ancient throne. The newly crowned reigning monarch has flawlessly, meticulously constructed an invisible, completely impenetrable wall of absolute institutional silence, effectively, ruthlessly abandoning the rogue, highly unpredictable elements of his extended family to the incredibly harsh, deeply unforgiving realities of the civilian legal system. If an ambitious, highly entitled aristocratic individual recklessly chooses to engage in highly questionable, deeply toxic financial maneuvers or incredibly vulgar commercial grifts, they must face the terrifying absolute consequences of those disastrous actions entirely alone, completely, utterly stripped of the incredibly powerful, highly protective mystical shield of sovereign immunity. This terrifying, incredibly calculated, and absolutely silent distance is the fundamental, absolute cornerstone of modern royal survival in an incredibly ravenous, highly connected digital age. Prince William, operating with the brilliant, incredibly cold, and entirely emotionless calculus of a ruthless corporate chief executive, profoundly recognizes that the ancient institution of the monarchy is a highly fragile, incredibly valuable global heritage brand. Every single time a peripheral, incredibly ambitious, non-working royal like Sarah Ferguson or Meghan Markle desperately attempts to aggressively monetize their fleeting, highly conditional royal proximity, they actively, violently degrade the intrinsic, mystical, and deeply historical value of that ancient legacy. By publicly, undeniably severing the official institutional ties and silently allowing the ruthless, entirely impartial, and incredibly destructive mechanisms of the law to systematically dismantle these highly toxic rogue operators, the future king flawlessly, brilliantly preserves the absolute purity of the sovereign brand. He is actively, terrifyingly demonstrating to the incredibly ravenous, highly skeptical global public that the British Crown is fundamentally a majestic, strictly law-abiding entity, completely, entirely intolerant of the vulgar, incredibly cheap corruption that inevitably plagues the desperate lower echelons of the aristocratic elite. The terrifying, absolute, and magnificent beauty of this completely ruthless sovereign strategy lies entirely in its incredible, unassailable, and profoundly chilling simplicity. The palace simply, effectively does absolutely nothing. They completely, utterly refuse to issue a clarifying public comment. They absolutely, firmly refuse to intervene in the impending legal destruction, and they terrifyingly, magnificently allow the incredibly powerful, completely destructive forces of the international legal system and the incredibly furious court of public opinion to completely obliterate their incredibly toxic, highly disruptive liabilities. The ancient, incredibly powerful institution beautifully, flawlessly survives the terrifying storm. The magnificent historical legacy remains entirely, completely untarnished by the incredibly dirty, highly embarrassing scandals of the exiled individuals, and the incredibly foolish, deeply arrogant relatives who dared to leverage the sacred crown for personal, highly vulgar financial gain are left entirely, completely abandoned in the incredibly cold, unforgiving, and completely silent ashes of their own magnificent ruin. The message echoing across the globe is incredibly clear and absolutely terrifying. The survival of the institution is paramount, and the absolute destruction of the rogue individual is simply the incredibly cold, entirely necessary cost of doing sovereign business. The final unassailable truth currently echoing heavily through the ancient, magnificent corridors of Buckingham Palace is incredibly chilling and absolutely, completely undeniable. Absolutely no one, regardless of their incredibly close historical proximity to the ancient throne, is completely immune from the terrifying, ruthless, and entirely pragmatic calculus of modern sovereign survival. The historical, incredibly deeply ingrained assumption that an aristocratic title automatically provides an impenetrable, eternal shield against absolute public and legal accountability has been permanently, completely shattered by the newly crowned king. The absolute, paramount priority of the British Crown, entirely superseding all incredibly fragile emotional attachments and deeply complex sentimental familial loyalties, is the total, unconditional preservation of its immaculate, majestic global reputation. The monarchy is fundamentally, incredibly acutely aware that its entire historical, incredibly powerful existence relies entirely upon the incredibly delicate, magnificent illusion of supreme moral authority and completely untarnished dignity. Therefore, any single individual incredibly reckless enough to actively introduce a highly toxic reputational or financial risk into the incredibly sacred, highly fortified core of the establishment will inevitably be ruthlessly, swiftly, and permanently excised from the absolute center of power. It absolutely fundamentally does not matter if your internationally recognized title is the Duchess of York or the Duchess of Sussex, because the terrifying, incredibly powerful, entirely emotionless machinery of the sovereign state views all highly unpredictable, ambitious peripheral members as completely, entirely expendable corporate liabilities. The incredibly heavy, majestic velvet rope has been permanently, violently cut, entirely separating the incredibly pure, untouchable, highly dedicated nucleus of the working royal family from the highly toxic, deeply embarrassing, incredibly chaotic individuals who were incredibly foolish enough to attempt to commercially monetize the sacred, ancient crown. The era of the heavily protected, deeply flawed, incredibly arrogant royal rogue is completely, entirely over, and the incredibly cold, terrifying, completely absolute dawn of the ruthless, heavily pragmatic sovereign corporation has finally, undeniably arrived. Thank you for bravely stepping into the incredibly dark, deeply unforgiving shadows of the monarchy with me today. I am Peter Neal, and until our next clandestine descent into the absolute darkest, incredibly heavily guarded secrets of the global elite, you are watching Confidential Royal Files. Keep your eyes incredibly wide open because the most terrifying, incredibly profound, absolute truths are always completely, entirely hidden in plain sight. While the incredibly sensational rumors currently dominating the global media landscape heavily suggest that King Charles is actively launching a literal, vicious, and unprecedented legal strike against Sarah Ferguson, dragging the highly vulnerable Meghan Markle directly into the terrifying crossfire, we must completely and fundamentally reorient our analytical perspective. When you meticulously peel back the incredibly dramatic, highly sensationalized layers of tabloid hysteria, the profound, underlying reality of this specific sovereign operation is revealed to be infinitely more complex and deeply fascinating. This is fundamentally, absolutely not a literal, bloodthirsty medieval purge orchestrated by a vengeful monarch, but rather a brilliant, incredibly sophisticated, and entirely modern masterclass in ruthless royal reputation management. The truly terrifying, magnificent hidden messages carefully encoded within these highly coordinated intelligence leaks completely redefine the very nature of the modern British establishment. Firstly, we must completely accept the cold, undeniable reality that the royal family has fundamentally transitioned from a traditional, emotionally bound aristocratic dynasty into a massive, incredibly highly fortified global heritage brand. The King and the Prince of Wales completely, absolutely understand that the majestic, thousand-year-old institution functions essentially as a multinational corporate entity, and the absolute, unconditional protection of its pristine, highly valuable global image infinitely supersedes the incredibly fragile, highly volatile emotional needs of any single individual relative. When a peripheral member introduces a massive, unacceptable reputational risk, the Crown does not react with familial compassion. It reacts with cold, entirely calculated corporate triage, actively prioritizing the eternal survival of the brand over the fleeting, highly embarrassing scandals of the individual. Secondly, this magnificent, deeply strategic shift completely establishes a terrifying, entirely unprecedented era of absolute personal responsibility within the heavily guarded walls of the royal establishment. The ancient, incredibly vast, and deeply protective sovereign umbrella of absolute immunity, which historically shielded deeply compromised, highly flawed aristocratic figures from the devastating consequences of their own disastrous actions, has been permanently, violently closed. The incredibly clear, undeniably terrifying message currently echoing across the Atlantic is that if you recklessly choose to engage in highly questionable, deeply toxic financial endeavors or incredibly vulgar commercial grifts, you are completely, entirely on your own. The ancient monarchy will absolutely not deploy its incredibly powerful, deeply secretive state apparatus to quietly clean up your highly publicized, deeply humiliating public messes, forcing the rogue individuals to entirely, completely bear the crushing, agonizing weight of their own catastrophic failures. Finally, the most profoundly chilling, incredibly brilliant aspect of this entirely new operational doctrine is the flawless, terrifying execution of the soft purge. The Crown completely, fundamentally realizes that a highly public, incredibly messy, and deeply transparent legal tribunal or a formal, official denunciation would only generate incredibly toxic, massively sustained media coverage, further damaging the incredibly fragile, highly valuable sovereign brand. Therefore, they have masterfully, silently opted for an incredibly sophisticated, completely invisible strategy of algorithmic and social isolation. There are no dramatic, highly televised public executions, and there are absolutely no formal, heavily documented arrest warrants. Instead, there is a terrifying, magnificent, and incredibly silent withdrawal of all absolute institutional support. The deeply compromised individuals are quietly, systematically stripped of their highly exclusive, incredibly lucrative access, their secure, heavily encrypted communication lines to the absolute center of power are permanently, completely severed, and their overall geopolitical influence is entirely, ruthlessly neutralized from the shadows. The incredibly powerful, deeply ancient institution simply, effectively, and beautifully pretends that these incredibly toxic, highly disruptive individuals completely cease to exist, orchestrating a magnificent, entirely invisible, and completely devastating soft purge that permanently, flawlessly cleanses the royal bloodline without ever spilling a single, highly publicized drop of blood. The magnificent velvet curtain has finally completely closed upon the incredibly naive era of unconditional royal protection. We are entirely witnessing the terrifying dawn of a ruthless corporate monarchy, where the eternal survival of the ancient crown will completely, flawlessly eclipse the fragile, highly volatile ambitions of the individual. The ultimate, incredibly profound question remaining for you, the incredibly astute and highly analytical viewers of this channel, is whether the heavily isolated, exiled royals can possibly survive this devastating, completely invisible starvation of absolute power. Dive directly into the comment section below and share your most forensic, highly calculated analysis of this unprecedented sovereign strategy. If this deep, incredibly dark descent into the terrifying shadows of Buckingham Palace has successfully captivated your mind today, I urge you to immediately hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Do not miss a single highly classified dossier as we continue to ruthlessly, meticulously decode the most secretive, ancient institution on the face of the earth. I am your host, Henry, and you have been watching Royal Today. Stay incredibly vigilant and always remember that the most terrifying, absolute truths are invariably completely hidden in plain sight.